What do you want to do with the rest of your life? That's the question the Bible's asking today. But we're not asking it the normal way, which is, when you ask 18-year-olds, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? We ask 15-year-olds or 21-year-olds, so what job do you want to do? Do you want to be a lawyer? Do you want to be a teacher? Do you want to be a vicar? Do you want to be a doctor? Whatever. We're not even talking about it from the perspective, someone in a midlife crisis. What do you want to do with the rest of your life? And we're talking about it from the perspective of quite extreme old age. And the reason we're there is because we read in the second chapter of Luke about an encounter with the baby Jesus which two people have. And in the responses which are written up in the Bible, I want to ask of you what you think your response is now, whatever age you are. Because Simeon, we're told, is the first we're told about. It's an old man called Simeon who we hear his eyes are dim, but he recognises Jesus and then says an extraordinary prayer which we still use in the church today. Now, Lord, thou let thy servant depart in peace according to thy will, for my eyes have seen the salvation and the glory of your people Israel, and it goes on. And there is a real sense of letting go. He's been praying for this moment, and now finally it's happened, and he feels his purpose on this life is done. So that is the first response, and I'll come back to a sort of modern example of an equivalent. But there is a second response, and the second response is in this character we find a little bit about. We find out her name is Anna. We find out her age, that she's 84 years old. We find out she was widowed a long time ago and has been praying in the temple for a very long time. And she too recognises this baby for who he is, that he's the Messiah. But her response is not withdrawal. What we find out in the Bible is that she went out and started preaching about this new baby to everyone she met, about this extraordinary person who'd come into the world. And she starts telling people about it. So if you like, whereas Simeon's response is withdrawal, her response is to go out and kind of tell the world. And so think through those characters and then think about what is God calling you now. And for a couple of modern equivalents, the first is a man who I never met, so I'm sharing someone else's encounter. It's actually an encounter by our Archdeacon, John Kiddle, who was telling me about a visit he'd made to Mount Athos. And Mount Athos is one of those quirky kind of Christian holy places, and it's a bit weird because it's sort of men only, and there's stuff full of monasteries, so there's loads of people kind of praying and stuff like that. And John said the men only thing he found a bit problematic, and it wasn't a perfect place by any means. However, he had this extraordinary encounter. So him and this party are visiting, and they met a guy from France, an old Frenchman. And they said, and the guy asked what they were doing, and they explained they were visiting, and they asked in return this old French guy, what are you doing? Why have you come to Mount Athos? And apparently he just said to them, I've come here to die. And he explained how the clothes he was wearing would be his shroud. He didn't have any other possessions. He'd had a very fulfilled life in France, but that had passed, and now he was letting go and just wanted to spend the last time on earth really praying and getting himself ready for the next life. And crucially, I think what apparently he gave off was this atmosphere of prayer and joy, sort of quiet joy in this simple, uncluttered life of prayer he was leading in the last stages of his life. And it recalls, if you like, Simeon's contentment, prayerful contentment. Right, I've done this. This is time now, and it's an utterly authentic response. But it's not the only one. And for another response, I think you turn to who's a person like Anna going out and talking. And an example which comes to me is of a man you may have heard of. He's got a half famous called Harry Patch, and he reached fame incredibly late in his life. So he was born at the beginning of the 20th century, and like enormous numbers of his generation, hundreds of thousands of them went off to fight in the First World War. And he fought at the Somme, and for 80 years of his life he lives a pretty normal life, along with all the other generation. They had a heck of a time getting back and trying to live their life after the traumas they'd gone through in the First World War. But he is unremarkable. However, as historians continue to want to find out about the First World War and continue to want to meet people, he just lived a very long time, and there were fewer and fewer witnesses who had fought at the Somme. And then in his late 80s and early 90s, he became the voice of that generation. he was able to speak for that generation about the hell they'd gone through. And he became this extraordinary advocate for peace. He said, you know, you don't know what war's like. War is like this. I've lived through it. This was awful. Do we really want to do this? And so what Harry Patch was articulating was an incredibly powerful voice for peace. But he only discovers this time of preaching in his extreme old age. You know, he starts being called to the pulpit when he's, what, 85, 90, 95. That's the peak of his powers. That is when he had the most influence. And in a way, it's a bit like Anna, you know, very late in her life, finding an incredibly important message that she wanted to share. And so often we think, oh, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? We think this is a question for kind of the young or the middle-aged. No, it's a question for everybody. And this gospel passage encourages us to think it through from the perspective of old age, but it always applies. What do you want to do with the rest of your life? And we have absolutely authentic responses, which are totally different, but are still totally faithful. One of engagement and one of detachment. But both, I think, are what God calls people to do sometimes.